Chapter 10. UK History. Important People. William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. He was a playwright and actor and wrote many poems and plays. His most famous plays include A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet. He also dramatised significant events from the past, but he did not focus solely on kings and queens. He was one of the first to portray ordinary Englishmen and women. Shakespeare had a great influence on the English language and invented many words that are still common today. Lines from his plays and poems, which are often still quoted, include "Once more into the breach," Henry V. "To be or not to be," Hamlet. "A rose by any other name," Romeo and Juliet. "All the world's a stage, As You Like It," "The Darling Buds of May," Sonnet 18, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Many people regard Shakespeare as the greatest playwright of all time. His plays and poems are still performed and studied in Britain and other countries today. The Globe Theatre in London is a modern copy of the theatres in which his plays were first performed. Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Born in Lincolnshire, Eastern England, Isaac Newton first became interested in science when he studied at Cambridge University. He became an important figure in the field. His most famous published work was Philosophiae Naturalis Principia, Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which showed how gravity applied to the whole universe. Newton also discovered that white light is made up of colours of the rainbow. Many of his discoveries are still important for modern science. Richard Arkwright, 1732 to 92. Born in 1732, Arkwright originally trained and worked as a barber. He was able to dye hair and make wigs. When wigs became less popular, he started to work in textiles. He improved the original carding machine. Carding is the process of preparing fibres for spinning into yarn and fabric. He also developed horse-driven spinning mills that used only one machine. These increased the efficiency of production. Later, he used the steam engine to power machinery. Arkwright is particularly remembered for the efficient and profitable way he ran his factories. Sarkar-e-Din Muhammad, 1759 to 1851. Muhammad was born in 1759 and grew up in the Bengal region of India. He served in the Bengal army and came to Britain in 1782. He then moved to Ireland and eloped with an Irish girl called Jane Daly in 1786, returning to England at the turn of the century. In 1810, he opened the Hindustan Coffee House in George Street, London. It was the first curry house to open in Britain. Mahomet and his wife also introduced shampooing, the Indian art of head massage, to Britain. Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936. Rudyard Kipling was born in India in 1865 and later lived in India, the UK and the USA. He wrote books and poems set in both India and the UK. His poems and novels reflected the idea that the British Empire was a force for good. Kipling was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1907. His books include Just So Stories and The Jungle Book, which continue to be popular today. His poem, If, has been voted among the UK's favourite poems. It begins with these words: "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise." If, Rudyard Kipling. Florence Nightingale, 1820 to 1910. Florence Nightingale was born in Italy to English parents. At the age of 31, she trained as a nurse in Germany. In 1854, she went to Turkey and worked in military hospitals, treating soldiers who were fighting in the Crimean War. She and her fellow nurses improved the conditions of the hospitals and reduced the mortality rate. In 1860, She established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St Thomas's Hospital in London. The school was the first of its kind and still exists today, as do many of the practices Florence used. She is often regarded as the founder of modern nursing. Alexander Fleming, 1881 to 1955. Born in Scotland, Fleming moved to London as a teenager and later qualified as a doctor. He was researching influenza, the flu, in 1928 when he discovered penicillin. This was then further developed into a usable drug by the scientists Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. By the 1940s, it was in mass production. Fleming won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1945. Penicillin is still used to treat bacterial infections today. Mary Peters, 1939. Born in Manchester, Mary Peters moved to Northern Ireland as a child. She was a talented athlete and won an Olympic gold medal in the pentathlon in 1972. After this, she raised money for local athletics and became the team manager for the women's British Olympic team. She continues to promote sport tourism in Northern Ireland and was made a Dame of the British Empire in 2000 in recognition of her work. Margaret Thatcher, 1925 to 2013. Margaret Thatcher was the daughter of a grocer from Grantham in Lincolnshire. She trained as a chemist and lawyer. She was elected as a Conservative MP in 1959 and became a cabinet minister in 1970 as the Secretary of State for Education and Science. In 1975, she was elected as leader of the Conservative Party and so became leader of the opposition. Following the Conservative victory in the general election in 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first woman Prime Minister of the UK. She was the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, remaining in office until 1990. During her premiership, there were a number of important economic reforms within the UK. She worked closely with the United States President, Ronald Reagan, and was one of the first Western leaders to recognise and welcome the changes in the leadership of the Soviet Union, which eventually led to the end of the Cold War. Roald Dahl, 1916 to 1990. Roald Dahl was born in Wales to Norwegian parents. He served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. It was during the 1940s that he began to publish books and short stories. He is most well known for his children's books, although he also wrote for adults. His best-known works include Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and George's Marvellous Medicine. Several of his books have been made into films. Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965. Churchill was the son of a politician, and before becoming a Conservative MP in 1900, was a soldier and journalist. In May 1940, he became Prime Minister. He refused to surrender to the Nazis and was an inspirational leader of the British people in a time of great hardship. He lost the general election in 1945, but returned as Prime Minister in 1951. He was an MP until he stood down at the 1964 general election. Following his death in 1965, he was given a state funeral. He remains a much admired figure to this day, and in 2002 was voted the greatest Briton of all time by the public. During the war, he made many famous speeches, including lines which you may still hear. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." Churchill's first speech to the House of Commons after he became Prime Minister, 1940. "We shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the street. We shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Speech to the House of Commons after Dunkirk, 1940. "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Speech to the House of Commons during the Battle of Britain, 1940. Clement Attlee, 1883 to 1967. Clement Attlee was born in London in 1883. His father was a solicitor, and after studying at Oxford University, Attlee became a barrister. He gave this up to do social work in East London, and eventually became a Labour MP. He was Winston Churchill's Deputy Prime Minister in the wartime coalition government and became Prime Minister after the Labour Party won the 1945 election. He was Prime Minister from 1945 to 1951 and led the Labour Party for 20 years. Attlee's government undertook the nationalisation of major industries like coal and steel, created the National Health Service, and implemented many of Beveridge's plans for a stronger welfare state. Attlee also introduced measures to improve the conditions of workers. William Beveridge. William Beveridge, later Lord Beveridge, was a British economist and social reformer. He served briefly as a Liberal MP and was subsequently the leader of the Liberals in the House of Lords, but is best known for the 1942 report Social Insurance and Allied Services, known as the Beveridge Report. The report was commissioned by the wartime government in 1941. It recommended that the government should find ways of fighting the 5 giant evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, and provided the basis for the modern welfare state. Dylan Thomas, 1914 to 1953. Dylan Thomas was a Welsh poet and writer. He often read and performed his work in public, including for the BBC. His most well-known works include the radio play Under Milk Wood, first performed after his death in 1954, and the poems Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which he wrote for his dying father in 1952. He died at the age of 39 in New York. There are several memorials to him in his birthplace, Swansea, including a statue and the Dylan Thomas Centre.